Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to speak to this group. It's you guys have a very exciting charge that you're doing here with neuroscience and architecture, and I think I find myself coming to some of the same kind of intersections that this group is coming to as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Eduardo gave me the introduction, so I can skip over that. But I come to thinking about these issues about imagination as a phenomenon and how we might engage it through my work as an artist over a few decades of working in combining computer science and contemporary fine art. Just some examples of things. They take all these different kinds of forms. Underlying many of them is this kind of concern about how we engage with spatial and pictorial experiences that are being augmented and extended by mediated environments. So, there's a lot of verbiage to describe things that now we put into catch-alls like virtual reality, augmented reality, computer games. But the work was always kind of navigating spaces that are a little more interstitial, where physical experience and virtual experiences are kind of put into interplay with each other. And usually with multi-user environments, but also in things that are very sculptural. Same kind of algorithmic processes that kind of look at how algorithms and a kind of algorithmic lens and an algorithmic brush or chisel in a way change our modes of expression and our modes of perception. So I just kind of throw a bunch of images of previous work up there to kind of get them out of the way, but also to kind of get to the point where as I'm going through and building these different projects in different ways, I'm becoming more concerned with just how people's perception of these different kind of aspects of a mediated experience or of a physical experience become cognitively fused into, I think, a new quality of experience that now we have that maybe that differs in some ways from previous kind of regimes of experience, or maybe kind of accentuates them in ways that gives us affordances that we haven't previously had. So I'll talk a little more in depth about a project that I think was a real turning point for me in thinking about how my own kind of research track and artistic tracks might result in some new engagements. And so there's the Scalable City project, which looked at how new ways of both kind of seeing the world around us became integrated with new ways to kind of specify what that world might turn into. And so the project itself has many different kind of forms and manifestations, but it's often these kind of large semi-immersive projected environments where, so here's a person who's navigating this like computer game space or virtual world, and as she's doing it, she's triggering algorithmic relationships to come into play. It takes elements that are somewhat familiar from our lived and built environment, but are then kind of distorted by their process of being kind of consumed by computational processes that then give them new kind of affordances that then are articulated as she moves through this space. So for instance, there's a bunch of architectural pieces that are in this environment, and they're all taken from photogrammetry methods. So a bunch of photographs taken, and then you try to extract the 3D geometry from it. You try to then kind of analyze what that 3D geometry is to understand what might be the ground, what might be the roof, how might pieces reassemble themselves. And then as a person moves through the environment, they build out networks of roads that are kind of latent systems in the landscape and trigger the kind of reassembly of these architectural pieces. And they have a new kind of logic as they kind of reassemble. So it's trying to look at this relationship between means of representation, means of codification, and then what they might lend themselves to as methods or means of expression. So this is a project. It's kind of like a video game, but it's kind of not. I mean, there's no particular point or score. And typically when I've set it up in museums, different places kind of all over the world, it gets set up from short times of a few weeks to long times of several years at a time, and the project just kind of runs. And so if it's running for a few years, I'll come back and I'll see that, here's what a few thousand people have done to transform this environment. And so because the project doesn't have a specific point, it like keep a score, develop the whole world, or what might motivate a video game. What's motivating to me about it is the kind of engagement that people have with it. That I present them with certain kinds of symbols that are familiar. You can tell that's a house, and that's a landscape, and that's a road, and that's a tornado of automobiles, which everyone's very familiar with that. But like that tornado of automobiles, I'm presenting these familiar symbols in unfamiliar ways, and they have interactions with each other that are also novel. And so what I'm interested in is how people have different kinds of understanding and engagement with that environment. It unfolds with more complexity as they become more involved in it. It moves from a kind of operational kind of confusion or the need to develop an operational literacy with the project, to then starting to engage in what might be the conceptual and the conceptual stakes, the conceptual arguments that the artwork itself is making. So after showing it many places, I started to capture all the data of people interacting with it. Because if I was standing there and I was watching someone, I might be able to say, oh, why don't you look over there? And if I made that suggestion to them, they would kind of go from being like totally confused to all of a sudden being like, ah. And, they get this kind of little bit of insight. And they wouldn't even really know what that insight was. It would be hard for them to kind of immediately express what that insight was. But I could actually see them have that moment of insight. And then their operations would start to shift. So I needed to build a system in the project where, because I couldn't be at all these places for all this time and give these little hints, but maybe the project itself could respond to it so it could understand it. So I started capturing all the data of how people interacted in it. And then I started bringing that data back into the lab and visualizing it back into the environment and coming up with different ways of graphing and comparing it. So here, this is a kind of a heat map of how different people have moved through this particular part of the environment, where the amount of time they spend, the kind of bulbs grow bigger, and then started to do far more sophisticated kind of graphing. So scatter plots of how long people spent in times, how fast they were moving, how much did they change their point of view, and from that started to develop these kind of phenotypes of people's experience of this space, of this virtual space. And so here is one visualization of a few people. So the blue dot is actually someone moving through the environment. The red dot is a virtual camera that their movements control. So they're actually seeing what that red dot is from that red dot's perspective. And here all I'm going to do is normalize a bunch of people's movements right at the origin. And then just trace out the kind of way, this kind of elastic band they have to control the virtual camera view that they have of the environment. And that in itself starts to kind of show a certain quality of experience that different kinds of users have, and they start to cluster in different ways, where some people have this kind of creating this far more expansive view on the environment, and some are creating this kind of more tight and controlled version. So with all these kinds of trying to quantify what that experience, what that qualitative experience was, I try to look at different kinds of aesthetic-based analyses of it. So this camera view, it's what they see. Here's other ways in which I'm trying to characterize what they see. So I'm taking the color space that's being produced as they navigate through this. And some people tend to produce a color space that has more sky, some has more landscape, some has more objects that are active in the scene, some have less. And the interesting thing is, if I would ask people to say, well, what is it that you found yourself drawn to? What kind of things did you like to look at? It would actually be fairly hard, again, for them to be able to kind of say what it was they found themselves looking at. But if I look at the data of what they're looking at, I can fairly clearly see that, this person really, found a way to kind of produce all of this kind of visual phenomena with his project, which is different from what this other person did. And so with kind of making those kind of phenotype of experience, I could start to then build feedback systems into the project. So this is showing kind of complexity of scenes that would then do this. It would try to modulate the novelty of the experience with the understanding of the experience. And it seemed to me, if I can, as an artist, that's kind of maybe one of my main aspirations, is how I can kind of take what you know and show you kind of sides of this phenomena that you think that you've never really seen before or never understood. And that by doing that, I move you from a site of novelty or confusion into a deeper understanding of the situation. So with data analysis starting to do that, and then I started to look at what I might be able to do with looking directly at brain phenomena. And so along these lines, I was also at this time really starting to think about what this kind of artwork itself really was doing culturally. So I talk about this as artwork, and it's not a painting, and maybe sometimes it's kind of like a sculpture, but this kind of it has a different set of stakes in it. And I started to think that what I was doing with these kind of computer science research, kind of avant-garde artwork combinations, was this thing that I characterize as speculative culture. That it was a way to try to make these kind of somewhat prototypes of new kinds of cultural experiences. And what those prototypes might be doing, here was a few bullet points about what they might be doing. It might be, it might serve a social role of helping us, attenuate our anticipation of the world that we're rapidly producing. And as we do it, we probably need to kind of examine how our own claims about what this futurity be might be reified by our present. And so there's a kind of a humanistic scholarship aspect of this as well. And I guess I've got this slide a little bit out of order in my talk, but some of this will start to make more sense, as I go down in this talk a little bit further. But I started to look more deliberately at science fiction as the kind of primary mode of speculative culture that we have, that's been around for 100 years or so, that we might be able to kind of use to understand what its impact is on social and cultural development. But one of the real key things that is, what you guys are all onto is that we're in this new era of cognitive and neuroscience, of understanding the brain in, of course, ways we've never had before. And how might this new understanding change the kinds of cultural experiences that we create? So this led really directly into the creation here of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, which started in 2013. So it was a proposal I wrote to the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation to set up a center that would study the phenomena of imagination. And so this is our mission: understand, enhance, and enact human imagination. So we have a mission that I can only characterize as grandiose, But there's ways that we do it, and I think what we're starting to do is develop a theory of human imagination that has an experimental basis as well as a kind of scholarly basis. And so there's a bunch of different types of people that get involved in the Clark Center that come from all of these different disciplines, all of whom either have a way of studying imagination or have developed imaginative methodologies to move their field forward. We also work with a great deal of a number of science fiction authors. And here's a kind of 5 of them who are very deeply involved with us and who also all happen to be graduates of UC San Diego. And it's one of the secrets of UC San Diego that we've produced more of today's notable science fiction authors than any other university in the world, and completely unintentionally and accidentally. And so, I saw that as this, that there's something about the kind of nature of, there must be something about the nature of thinking in scientific research and in kind of and cultural activity here that helped to produce these folks, and maybe we could actually try to bottle that and do it more deliberately. And that might screw the whole thing up too, So that's when you do something deliberate that's been happening accidentally on its own, you run some risks. So from this, if I say that we have this grandiose mission to do all this stuff around imagination, then maybe the first question should be, well, what is imagination? So imagination is it's not a really specific term, right? It's a popular cultural term. It doesn't have like the scientific specificity of RNA or something. So what is imagination, and how might we even be able to kind of define it? So one thing I did initially was start to look at, well, what do people think imagination is? And I got hundreds and hundreds of things that people have said about imagination, and typically in a fairly casual way like this. But the poster child for genius, Albert Einstein, surely must have some insight in imagination, and he says some great things about it. That it's more important than knowledge, that knowledge is limited, but imagination circles the world, which is great poetry. But I don't know that it helps kind of nail down what imagination is. So if that's what it is, how do we study that? How do we improve that? Do we make that circle around the world tighter, or make it go around the world a few more times? I don't know. That doesn't really help. He says this other thing, that imagination is everything. It's the preview of life's coming attraction. So imagination is everything is totally useless. And that doesn't give us any specificity at all. The preview of life's coming attractions, I'm kind of drawn to that just because I'm an artist and have a degree in filmmaking. So coming attractions are something that I can appreciate. And they also kind of are there, coming attractions are there to kind of whet and engage your imagination about what an experience is. So there's a bit of something there. And again, logic gets you from A to Z, imagination gets you everywhere. Well, I won't go into that one right now. I'll skip to this next quote from another kind of renowned smart person, Oliver Sacks, and who says, I think, something that's probably a lot more useful to think about as a starting point to understand imagination, that every act of perception is some degree an act of creation, and every act of memory is to some degree an act of imagination. Now, actually, I think that's a really useful description or gives a number of handholds on imagination that we can start to dig into here. So this integration between perception, creation, memory, imagination, I actually think that's a pretty good rubric to start to think about. And I'll kind of throw up something else in relationship to imagination, that art, I think, is this interesting domain in which to explore these questions about what is imagination, because a quote from George Raymond in 1898 about art as distinctively a product of imagination, while science therefore may find a single form interesting. In itself, art never does. It looks for another form with which the first may be compared. While science may be satisfied with a single fact, art at its best never is. And I think this kind of understanding about how art functions to engage with meaning making in a different way than science, I think is a fairly nice comparison between, as an artist, I think it's a nice comparison. Maybe a scientist might not think it's so nice, but at least we're kind of making a discourse between the two. And so I'll give you maybe some examples to kind of think about how art works in relationship to engaging the imagination in multiple levels. And we think back to that Oliver Sacks quote for a moment. So this is the church ceiling mural of the Church of St. Ignacio in Rome. And I think in this mural you see imagination happening on multiple levels. So for one thing, the church ceiling itself is flat, yet it's using a painting effect called trompe-l'oeil to build off of these arched windows on the side of the cathedral to seemingly extend those architectural features into the architectural features of a more domed ceiling, and a domed ceiling that in fact opens up into a purely imaginative realm of another world or another zone. So we have this kind of way in which the painter and the architect have used perspective and the kind of perceptual notions that our eyes and brains use to kind of situate us in perspective environments to put us into this virtual reality that the narrative is building off of. So it becomes a very effective way of blending our perceptions with blending our narrative imaginations into giving a very powerful experience of an imagined experience. And then even at a lower level, we see these figures. These are angels and other things that are flying around in here. And we see them literally as these figures, yet of course all they are is little daubs of colored pigment. So even at a very low level of having an engagement with the phenomena at its kind of basis level of syntax, it requires this kind of engagement of our perception to trigger it into having a kind of an imaginative response to that environment. And now this, in Western culture, we started to create these methods of representation that had greater and greater veracity that might, in fact, take this kind of imagination, the artist's imagination, out of the loop. So here's Albrecht Dürer, and he's showing one of his perspective tools that he created to try to capture a better verisimilitude and more veracity of the world around him. Yet he comes up with this kind of new language of representation that is used by him immediately to kind of just give an even more believable engagement with his imagination. So for instance, he did this etching of this rhinoceros, having never seen a rhinoceros, and doing it from just accounts of what people told him a rhinoceros looked like and what its features were. And it became, for a couple hundred years, the kind of canonical representation of a rhinoceros in Europe, even though people actually went and saw rhinoceroses and they're like, wait, there's no horn in the middle of their back, and they're not clad in armor. But it had such power in its veracity that its vision held. So the imagination, can overcome our own experiences of reality. And it happens, and as we saw in the mural, it not only happens at that narrative level, but it happens at the lowest level of our perception. So the famous photographs of Muybridge to try to demonstrate whether or not horses' legs left the ground when they were running, this set of still photographs can easily be seen in sequence, and we suddenly think, we're imagining that we're seeing a moving horse, right? So everyone's very familiar with the phenomena of how cinema works. But of course, in cinema, we're never actually seeing things in motion. We're just seeing discrete moments in time. It's that low level of our perceptual imagination that takes those still images and puts them into something that we think is in motion. So, I would say that art is ultimately this collaboration between our senses, our memories, and our imagination. And of course, you could say that that's just simply what reality is. That in understanding what the real world is, we're continuously fusing information from our senses, correlating it with things we remember, and kind of making them coherent with our imagination. And maybe I won't go into all this, but I'll say, and that's a very old theory of reality. It goes, and that's Plato's cave, where basically, we're the prisoners sitting on a platform, and our only understanding of reality is looking at the shadows cast on the wall of the cave. So with that is a bit of a basis for thinking about imagination and how it relates to perception, memory, expectations, anticipation. What might we be able to do to think about a theory of imagination? And so since I said the mission of the Clark Center is grandiose, our problem space is also grandiose. And this is it, basically. It's, I guess I'm falling into Einstein's trap here with imagination as everything, because essentially that's what I've graphed here, because this is the space of imagination. And I think it's things that move from, on the spatial scale, from, or the phenomena scale, from the neurological to the cognitive to the social. It moves on the temporal scale from taking us from one moment to the next. So as I'm sitting here speaking, I'm rambling through a sentence, and you're hopefully hanging on every word. You're wondering, what might the next word be that I'm going to speak, right? So we were in a very tight coupled loop of kind of empathetic relationship and communication, and your imagination is always engaged. And I might veer off to one, in a different direction, but that's a very short loop of imagination. You're also in a kind of longer loop, is this guy really going to finish on time? What will happen to him when he goes over his time? What will our moderators do? Will they physically yank him off the stage? How's this weekend going to turn out? So we start to, our imagination time frame extends. And such that we imagine times thousands of years in the future. We can even, might be able to even imagine, the effects of our activities on the planet 100 years in the future. Some people can imagine that, some people can't. And that's a problem, right? So there's a temporal factor, and we also imagine our own personal situation, or our local situation, or our global situation, and even our cosmic situation. So if that's the space of imagination, what might be methods of engaging it that might be productive? If we are going to try to accelerate imagination. And I think there's some very interesting methods that have come into play in the last number of years. Certainly computation is one that is extremely interesting, and I'll show you some examples of some things that we're doing with new computational methods to help to extend and accelerate imagination. And of course, everything we're doing around understanding human behavior cognitively and through neuroscience gives us opportunities to possibly directly engage in imagination. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some early stage projects that we're doing in the Clark Center that pick out different parts of this matrix. So if I look at this kind of near the origin, to look at things that might shed light on the neuronal basis of imagination in very short time frames, one thing that we can do is look at, compare human brain functions with our closest relatives, the Neanderthals. And so Neanderthals, we have artifact records that show that over about 500,000 years they had a very stable artifact material culture, right? They made arrowheads, and then they made more arrowheads. And there's a little bit of difference that we see that comes out, but we see the period of overlapping with modern humans, and on a much shorter time frame, modern human material culture, picked up kind of started at the same place with the Neanderthals, but in a short time frame, came up with things like that are much more advanced, like artisanal mustaches and Google Glass. So, humans, do we have more imagination? I guess that's maybe one of the basis of this thought, and where might that imagination reside? So we're working with a stem cell researcher, Alison Moultrie, in looking at how we might be able to look at Neanderthal neuronal functioning. So taking, we know the Neanderthal genome. We know how it differs from the Homo sapien genome in a few key areas, particularly ones that control neurological development. And Alison can take human stem cell and change those genes to the Neanderthal genes and grow, and now is growing Neanderthal brain organoids. So we have now, they've been growing now for a few months and they've come up with good methods to see how big they can grow. They don't have a vascular system, so once they get a certain size, all the insides start dying off. But we're trying to get them to a size and a complexity such that we can then stimulate them on these electrical surfaces that have lots of different points, and stimulate them with different burst patterns that increase in complexity and diversity, and compare them to the human brain organoid response to those same kind of stimulation patterns. We can already see that the organoids between Homo sapiens and these pseudo-Neanderthal brain organoids, the human ones have greater morphological complexity. And the hypothesis is that they will anticipate more complex stimulation patterns than the Neanderthal ones. So stay tuned to that. So we can move up from the neuron and start to look more at cognition. And so I've been trying to look at what my colleagues in cognitive and neuroscience are able to kind of see in brain activity, and which particular things seem to produce enough tractable signal that are related to phenomena that I think are underpinnings of imagination. And so one that I think is a component of imagination is anticipation. So when you have an expectation that something is going to be a certain thing. This is not the apparatus we're using, but I'll skip that. So one of these things that gives a very interesting signature that I think relates to anticipation is this phenomenon called the uncanny valley. And maybe some people are familiar with it. It is famously misused or exposed in movies like The Polar Express, where Tom Hanks played like 20 different characters in that movie, and they all looked really creepy. And because there's this, you know what Tom Hanks looks like, and this looks like a kind of shrunken, childlike version of the adult Tom Hanks, and it's just wrong. And that's the uncanny valley. And in fact, it produces there's a pretty good brain response to that experience. And you see it in relating to computer graphic characters or animated characters or to androids. And the difference is when something starts to look almost human, we're very aware that it's not human. You know, if something looks very cartoonish or looks like a robot, we're pretty comfortable with understanding that that's not trying to be human, it's something else. But if it comes close and doesn't nail it, it attenuates our responses. We are anticipating, we're getting an experience that's different than what we're anticipating. And so we're trying to look at ways we might be able to trigger and work with this uncanny valley phenomena directly in the kind of simplest way possible. And it brings me back to this painting by Diego Velázquez, Las Meninas, which itself I think gives a little bit of I think it provokes a little bit of that uncanny valley experience. And it does it because here, you know, we're used to like looking at paintings, but we're not really used to paintings looking at us. And so in this painting, you know, we're actually situated at where the artist is actually looking at us, and we're situated, but he's really looking at the king and queen of Spain, who we see in this mirror. But they're virtually positioned where we are as a viewer. And then everybody in this painting is like staring at us. And it points out that that one of the things that we're really attenuated to is eye contact. And so we can tell, you know, if I'm, you know, looking at someone in the audience and I'm like, you know, talking to you, but maybe I'm looking like 6 feet behind you, you know, you might start to like jump up to try to get in my field of view, even though my eyes are only like a degree or two off. You can actually really tell that. Or if I'm looking at you and maybe I'm just looking a little bit too long at you, and you're like, okay, why aren't you talking to the rest of the audience? You know, and you're very attenuated to that time difference. So now we're building a system where we measure that and learn the kind of differentiations that people have from this uncanny valley response, and not so that we can avoid it, but so that we can use it. And that's one of the key things, you know, as an artist, artists always try to find these impactful phenomena, and those become the tools of your trade. So, you know, every horror story ever written, you know, invokes the uncanny valley in some way. So we can start to get this little snippet of cognitive response to that. We can also do it if we look at spatial navigation experiences. There's a fairly well-studied understanding of how we have a couple of different types of navigational frameworks, an allocentric one and an egocentric one. You know, so one where we could think of the allocentric one as we're in world coordinate system, like we're looking at a map and we're trying to understand how to navigate based on a map view and a map understanding of a world. Or we're sitting there driving around listening to our GPS. Turn left 50 feet, turn right 100 feet, which gives us a more egocentric understanding of that space. And we can actually see different parts of the brain that, you know, kind of are activated based on whether you're using one type of spatial engagement or the other. And the idea is, can we switch people between these? So we've started to build this virtual environment, and I'll show this film where there's this spatial navigation activity that takes place in a multi-user virtual world, and it's built out of this somewhat kind of uncanny kind of representation of reality. And what happens is once we start to find that people are strongly using one type of navigational system, we start to switch the scales of the environment. And the scales switch in one of two ways. Either the user scale shifts or the world scale shifts. And it shifts along kind of an infinite plane. And what we find is when you move this through a scale shift, it's almost like you wipe their slate clean. And now they have to kind of renegotiate what their own relationship to that spatial experience will be. So the scale thing has been a kind of a very effective way to think about anticipating the global space that they're moving through. We've also started to take these ways in which, if I go back to that Scalable City project that started to look at how people's behavior influenced how they understood complex experience. And we've been mapping that into a learning system, a learning tool called Rubella. And Rubella is a project that we started in collaboration with the Rady School a few years back, and last year spun out as a startup company, and works with a bunch of different clients now. But the idea is essentially that we work with behavioral and organizational psychologists who try to understand how people interact and understand, complex social experiences. And what we did is create this virtual world where all of these kinds of characteristics that psychologists would gauge by doing anecdotal observation, surveys, interviews, we would do those with the people in the environment, but then analyze the kind of data that they're doing as they leave traces in that environment and make correlations back to these kind of psychological based assessments. And in this way can scale what would typically be something that might be a dozen people engaged with direct observation to thousands of people, and getting about a 80 to 90% correlation with what the behavioral psychologists see in the same situation. So for instance, we look at voice patterns, and from voice patterns we can assess whether or not teams are actually collaborating well together. We look at how they move. I'll skip these videos because then we'll completely run out of time if I show them. We look at how they use complex data to support decision making in an environment, how they parse responsibilities amongst team members, and from all this can kind of assess with data analytics whether or not they're discovering the environment well, whether or not they're having good social imagination, social creativity, and decision making together. And then the environment itself can modify itself to work with different kinds of people who respond to things differently. Maybe I'll skip that. Oh yeah, because I want to get to this. So this is, so then a lot of the work has to do with how we might think about how we collaborate with, between humans and machines. So we're starting to build models of machine imagination. And and this is a project that you'll be able to see across the hall during the break time. So just go out the back door of the black box across the hall, and this is set up in the lab over there. And what this project is it's a genetic algorithm system where we grow artificial life entities, and they come up with different kind of solutions to surviving the environment that they're a part of. And it works across multiple scales, from a kind of small, almost molecular scale to kind of organoid level scale to then kind of biological model scale, and ultimately a kind of cultural and social scale. And I'll just give you a hint of somewhat how this works. You have multiple ways that you interact with it, including with an EEG device. And so this woman now is looking at this artificial life colony and is going to then focus and examine a particular entity within that environment. And as she selects that, it then starts to go through a set of genetic mutations. And here's this kid down here is doing it now. And so we're trying to measure and utilize his own engagement with this complex phenomenon to create a collaborative, symbiotic outcome between these two systems of imagination, the computational one and the human one. We do it in virtual reality, and I'll skip that. And I would say that's kind of the one side, what I would call an extrapolative computational imagination, because the genetic algorithm system comes up with just a kind of a shotgun approach to solutions to the problem space that it's a part of. But we can also look inside the space, the imaginative zone, in what I would call an interpolative imagination. And we're working with Google on a project that people have probably seen some examples of, where we use neural net processes to interpolate between data space. And so this is a part of their deep dream system. And so we're building a system that takes our genetic algorithm methods to extrapolate from a kind of known corpus, and then using a neural net system to interpolate between the spaces of that corpus. And we're doing it around shapes and spatial experience. So we have to actually teach neural nets what space is and what shapes are. So we work from, here's a polygon, to here's a solid, to here's objects. Now you start to train them and come up with your own objects. So it's generating its own kind of, we're doing chairs and cars and things that we have a lot of data on. I said earlier, and I'll just wrap this up, that we do a lot of work with science fiction. We run the medical analysis of the Qualcomm Tricorder X Prize in the Clark Center. We do work with a lot of different artists and science fiction authors, a workshop with Marina Abramovich and Kim Stanley Robinson that produced an installation that went to the Venice Biennale 2 years ago. And there's a movie online you can watch. Doing a project now with Bruce Sterling for the Vitra Design Museum in Germany, and that looks at the kind of a future scenario of living in a robotic, architecturally augmented environment. And we run courses. And science fiction fantasy workshop we run here every summer. We launched a new major in speculative design. So all these ways of thinking about futurity and what, how we might design the future we actually want to live in. And I'll just end with a plug that we run lots of events here, and most of them are actually here. So we have a speaker series. We do the main events that we don't do here is we do an event at the Smithsonian every year called The Future is Here. So pay attention to our website. We run a science fiction flick series where we bring in kind of notable science fiction films and kind of discuss them from their scientific, their social, and their cultural perspective. We often have people who, like we had Richard Dreyfuss here for Close Encounters. We had Hal and Dave here for 2001. We're supported by good people. And I'll leave with this, but when we always return back to Clark himself to help guide us, and so there's a good way to end this, to think about the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. So good words for us to all live by. So thanks.